In our fast-breaking story today, the New York Times declares war on the Pentagon, so to speak. Welcome to Occupy Democrats. Click the subscribe button if you like fast-breaking stories. Now, no doubt, this has been an embattled week for Pete Hegseth, but the incoming assault featured in today's story, it's not coming from Congress or the family of the fishermen he may have killed, but from the Fourth Estate, specifically the New York Times. Now, wait until you see what they just decided to do about this.
Tonight, the Defense Department has confiscated the badges of Pentagon reporters from virtually every major media organization in America, from Fox News and Newsmax to NBC, CBS, ABC, The Wall Street Journal, CNN, and everybody in between. Why did the press get kicked out of the Pentagon? Because Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth tried to make them sign a permission slip to be there, where they would agree not to publish information his team didn't like. To agree to that would be akin to agreeing not to be a reporter. So real reporters and real news organizations left. Since 1943, the Pentagon has been accessible to the press through wars, national crises, Republican and Democratic administrations. To be clear, the U.S. military's policy of opening the Pentagon to the press was never a favor to the press. It was an obligation to a country that asks its sons and daughters to serve in harm's way. When a country asks that, then those who send them into harm's way should be at minimum be willing to answer questions about it. And they have been for 82 years until 5 o'clock tonight. This is not even a veiled attempt to intimidate the press, and it's not going to work. All of the media that walked out of the Pentagon today, including, like I said, Fox News and Newsmax, they're still going to report on the Pentagon. They don't need Secretary Hegseth's permission slip to do it, and they don't need a desk in the building. And time is going to prove that is true. But make no mistake, a dark day for freedom of the press and freedom for you to know what's going on. See you tomorrow.
So our breaking story today, why it is a major milestone in the relationship between the free press and a restrictive government. And in just a second, you'll see why this story is so important. Well, one of the reasons is, well, we could end up with this.
The Pentagon today held its first briefing in nearly half a year as it faces bipartisan backlash over that September attack on an alleged drug trafficking boat in the Caribbean. The credentialed attendees were a host of right-wing media figures, including Laura Loomer and former Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz. Gaetz is now a host on the pro-Trump network OAN. It follows a major overhaul of Pentagon press rules this fall that required journalists to sign a restrictive new policy, and that prompted an exodus of traditional news outlets from the building.
Okay, here's today's fast-breaking story. It's a shot to the chops of Pete Hegseth's Pentagon, courtesy of the New York Times.
Controversy this morning around the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. The New York Times says it is suing Hegseth and the Pentagon over new rules limiting access to reporters. Let's bring in Willie Larry. He's following the story for us this hour, coming from our Washington bureau. So, Willie, let's talk about this again. An issue we've heard about before, but now, of course, the Times taking action, saying this new policy is unconstitutional.
That's right, Angie. This all started back in September when the Pentagon issued these new restrictions on journalists. After some pushback, the regulations were finalized in October. The Pentagon wanted all credentialed journalists to sign a document essentially agreeing to only report on authorized Defense Department releases, meaning no leaks. The vast majority of journalists and news organizations covering the Pentagon refused to sign and in somewhat dramatic fashion walked out en masse. They've now been replaced by mostly right-wing organizations and bloggers hand-picked by the Pentagon. And just this week, the Department of Defense held its first press briefing since the new regulations came into effect. Now the New York Times is suing the Department of Defense and Secretary Pete Hegseth, arguing that the restrictions are infringing on the Times and its journalists' right to free speech and freedom of the press.
And essentially, this, of course, as you pointed out, is to sort of prevent any of those leaks, to police, if I can call it, sort of how the media is reporting things. But have these new rules actually stopped any leaks? Has it been successful, Willie?
Not really. Journalists are still being journalists and doing what they do. And this lawsuit actually comes at a time when Hegseth and the Pentagon are under scrutiny over their own handling of sensitive information. U.S. media is reporting that a review from the Pentagon's Inspector General found that Secretary Hegseth risked the safety of U.S. troops when he communicated via the messaging app Signal about upcoming U.S. strikes on Houthi rebels in Yemen. Back in March, a journalist from The Atlantic had accidentally been added to the messaging chain. Hegseth responded to the IG report on social media saying, quote, "No classified information, total exoneration, case closed, Houthis bombed into submission. Thank you for your attention to this report." Now, there is also controversy brewing over the Trump administration's launch of more than 20 strikes on alleged drug boats in the Caribbean that have killed roughly 80 people. There's now a bipartisan effort underway on Capitol Hill to try and learn more about the very first strike back on September 2nd, amid concerns that a follow-up hit may have been illegal or even a war crime. It's important to note, Angie, that so far the White House has been defending Hegseth and stands by the Secretary of Defense.
Willie, appreciate the update on this. Thank you for this.
Well, as Thomas Jefferson used to say, I think, our liberty depends on the freedom of the press, and that cannot be limited without being lost.